So welcome everybody to this evening's Oxford Economic Society talk. This evening's talk, I'm Ben, the Treasurer for the Society, and earlier this week we had Professor Harjun Chang in to talk about the consequences of the coronavirus for the economy. And this evening, as our guest, we have Professor Rolf Lüders, who's the Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Chile and a former Minister of Finance for the Chilean government, and he will be talking about the Chilean economic growth experience. So whenever you're ready, Professor Lüders, you can take it away and start sharing your slides.
Thank you very much, Ben. Well, it certainly is a pleasure to talk to all of you about the Chilean experience, and I will try to make the talk relatively short so that we have time for questions, which usually reflect the interest of the participants. For me, it's very difficult to know exactly what you're interested about our experience. And so I will do something more general, and then we can go into questions and answers. Okay, I show you the slides. This is a picture which was taken about a year ago in last October, and shows how the city looked like at that day. You see, they were burning buildings, they were burning wood and stuff on the streets and so on and so forth. So we had a social outburst of quite grave consequences, let's say. Okay, and this is the same place this year, which is a year after the original outburst, and this is they're commemorating the last year's outburst. And what you see here is a church which is on fire, and also downtown Santiago. Okay, so that gives you an idea of how things look like now. Okay, now we didn't have anything like that. We had peace, let's say, in a certain way. We can discuss that later. Between 74, let's say, and October of last year. And what happened in September 1973, that again, because we had grave social conflicts, the military took over the Chilean government, and they changed the economic and social system. And they did it advised by what's called the Chicago Boys, which is a group of Chileans who studied at the University of Chicago in the 1960s mainly, and the early 1970s. And then were called on by the Chilean government to implement this reform of our the previous economic system. I will talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. Now this transformation, this economic transformation, which took place after 1973, has usually been hailed as having been relatively successful. It certainly increased living standards tremendously. In around 1973, Chile was in the middle of the table of Latin American economies in terms of GDP per capita. And in those same years, Latin America was in the middle of the world in terms of GDP per capita. So we were perfectly what I call mediocre country. Now this changed completely. Today, Chile is at the top of the Latin American countries in terms of GDP per capita, but also in terms of the social conditions of the people, let's say, in terms of education, health, and so on. We are certainly in all of those aspects the leading country in Latin America. There's only one other country, Panama, which has something similar. But all the rest of the Latin American countries are below us in that sense. Okay. And so this outburst, this social outburst of October of last year, came as a complete surprise, I think, for most Chileans. We never, at least I never expected anything like that. And the main call of those who were protesting, or are still protesting, is to change the economic model, which in Chile, economic model means the social market economy we have there. Okay, the outcome of this outburst is still uncertain, and I will show you that too. Okay, now Chile has a representative democracy in political terms, representative democracy, and has a social market economy. And in that respect, you see, our model is not so different from the model in Germany or France or United Kingdom, for that matter. You see, those are all varieties of about the same model, and the model is essentially a free market economy. The economic model is essentially a free market economy, but in which the government plays a subsidiary role. Now, what means subsidiary role? That the government takes those actions which are not taken by the private sector or the intermediate bodies, which are necessary to achieve the maximal social benefits, let's say. So, or the common good, let's say, in terms of the language of the church. So the economy plays an important role, the state plays a very important role in our model. You see, we are a very regulated society. We have a free market economy, yes, but we are a very regulated society. Perhaps the aspects in which we differ from the European model and in general any other sort of market-based economy is that the social programs carried out by the states, financing of education, financing of health, financing of part of pensions and so on, well, these social programs are implemented on the basis of private enterprises. So in a way, what government does, it outsources the management of those programs to the private sector. Not completely, but to a large extent. And that makes our model slightly different from the others. However, the state is still, you see, regulating the educational, pension, health, and so on sectors, and it's certainly financing those programs for people who have lower incomes. Okay, so that's our system today. That's our system. Now I'll show you some of the outcomes. And the main outcomes are here. Now, this graph is, which I consider the most important graph to understand what's happening what happened, let's say, in Chile. It shows GDP per capita of Chile divided by GDP per capita of the USA. GDP per capita of Chile divided by the GDP per capita of the USA. And what you find is that during the 19th century, we grew faster than the US. Our trend in growth was higher, let's say, was faster than that of the United States. And then in the 20th century, we really, dropped relative to the USA. We still continue to grow in absolute terms, but in relative terms, relative to the United States, we grew much slower, and so our GDP per capita relative to that of the US dropped very severely. And then again, starting in 73, when we changed the economic model, well, we started to grow again very fast. So you have these three very distinct periods, 19th century, faster growth than the USA, and the 20th century up to 1980, slower growth than the USA, and then again, much faster growth than the USA. Now, the interesting thing is that the same graph you can draw if you compare Chile with Latin America, or if you compare Chile with Europe, or if you compare Chile with the Asia except China. But if you compare Chile with the rest of the world, you will always find the same pattern. Yeah. Relatively fast growth 19th century, relatively low growth in the 20th century, and then again, very fast growth after 1980. Now, each one of these periods can clearly be associated with an economic model. In the 19th century, we had a liberal economy. In the 20th century, we had an import substitution, industrialization-based economy, a protectionist economy. And now we have an open market economy in which the government plays an important role, but it's a subsidiary role. It intervenes if it's necessary to achieve the maximum social welfare. Okay, so this is very important because this shows you how important the economic systems are in the development of countries. And you see, we did very well under relatively liberal economy. Most economies in the 19th century were relatively liberal. We did badly under a protectionist government, discretionary interventionist economy in the 20th century, and we did very well now with the social market economy. We have been doing very well. And that's why the outburst is so strange, you see, because you have an economy which was growing very rapidly and which allowed a very rapid expansion of the social programs. And nevertheless, you see, we had this reaction to the model, which I repeat, took us from the middle of the table of Latin American countries to the top. Okay. In terms of poverty reduction, well, in 1850, where it's the first data we have about poverty, in 1850, poverty was 95% of the population lived in poverty, 95% of the population. Well, today, less than 9%, actually less than 8% of the population is living in poverty. So we had a tremendous reduction in poverty. Now, this reduction in poverty is basically associated to the fact that we were growing, and we have been growing absolutely all the time. And so our reduction has been relatively constant. Reduction of poverty has been relatively constant. But, and this is also interesting, poverty has been reduced not only because of a faster growth rate, let's say, or growth, economic growth, but has also been reduced because we spent a lot of money on social programs, pensions, education, health, and so on. And here you have the proportion of GDP spent on social programs, which reached about 20% of GDP, then dropped during actually the most successful period in growth in Chile. This period here, starting in 1980 and ending around 1990, those 10 years, were those years in which we grew the fastest. And at the same time, so the share of income spent on social programs was reduced. And from then on, we again started to have a rising trend in social expenditures. Okay, so growth plus social expenditures explain this. I don't want explain this very, steep reduction in poverty. Now this is income poverty. Okay. Now one argument which is given is that the social outburst is a reaction not to growth or reduction in poverty, of course, but this is a reaction to a very uneven income distribution. And this is true. Chile has a very uneven income distribution and has had a very uneven income distribution always. We have data. I don't have the table in this set of graphs or tables, but we can go back to 1870, and the Gini coefficient of monetary income was always around between 0.5 and 0.6, which is a very uneven income distribution. And Europe, you tend to have income distribution which are around 0.3 and 0.4. The Gini coefficient is between 0.3 and 0.4. Here it's 0.5 something. However, and this is important, you see, we reached a peak in Gini in 2000. So around 2000, we had the most uneven income distribution of modern times. But since then, the Gini has dropped to 0.48, which is in I don't know, 6-7 years, a very big drop in the Gini coefficient. And well, if you have income distributions by cohorts, what you find is that the present cohorts, the people who are now entering the labor force, they have the Gini coefficient of 0.2, so which is very even. So as the older generations die, by definition, income distribution in Chile will become more and more even. And at least I teach also a course at Stanford University, and one of my students at Stanford University projected the income distribution of Chile out 10 and 20 and 30 years, and already around 2030, our Gini coefficient would be about in the middle of the range of Gini coefficients in the OECD countries. So it is true that we still have a very uneven income distribution, but it's also true that we have had about 10 years or 7 years or so of a very important reduction in the Gini coefficient. And nevertheless, we had this reaction, which we did not have before when we had very uneven income distributions. Okay. This is social mobility. This is a table prepared by OECD, and what it basically shows, the green dots are the percentage of people whose fathers were low-income people who become high-income people, and there, of all of the countries in the OECD, we are the one with the highest social mobility. And the yellow thing is the same, it's another measure in which you take the percentage of people whose fathers were top earners, income earners, and whose children are also top income earners. And of course, the smaller the percentage is, the better. And Chile is relatively well placed there. It's not the best as in the other case, but it's well placed. So we have a reduction in the income differences, a very significant reduction, and we have high social mobility. And because it's not the same thing to have a uneven income distribution, if that's forever for everybody, or to have an uneven income distribution is that changes a lot on the basis of the merits of the people. And so we on both counts, we have been making tremendous progress, I think, in the last 10 years or so. And still, well, we had the social outputs. Okay, this is just a picture which shows downtown Santiago in the early 70s, and below you have the picture of the same business district, let's say, today. So the progress has been tremendous, and nevertheless we have the social outputs. Okay. Now I'm briefly going to go. Let me check the time. Do you have the time? I hear you. Yeah. Okay. Very briefly, how the outburst started was when government raised the fares of the metro in Santiago, the metro, by 3%, which did not affect students' fares. In Chile, the students have a special fare on the metro, and this 3% raise did not affect the students' fares. But nevertheless, the students protested and started not to pay the metro fares. And since police didn't do anything, then the students invited other people not to pay the fares. And so, you had thousands and thousands of people jumping over the gates into the metro. But then suddenly on October 8th, this happened, the raise in fares happened October 3 or 4 or something like this of 2019, of last year. And then on October 18th, maybe 2 weeks after that, suddenly you had thousands of people marching downtown. You had 40 metro stations taken over and burned down. You had large-scale lootings all over the place. By the way, Santiago is a city of about 7 million people, so it's a fairly large city. But you had these lootings all over the place, and you had fire barricades interrupting traffic and so on. So you had a real important social outburst. Okay. A few days later, you had large Pacific marches, and I show you one of them here. You had 1,200,000 people in Santiago marching down the streets, and these marches were pacific. There were no problems except at the end, which I will mention later. But basically, these were people who demanded, let's say, social change. And basically what they were demanding was a new constitution, a major change in Chile's economic development model, and in particular, a pension reform, a health reform, and what they call large business abuses, and they also demanded territorial equality. In Chile, in general, you have neighborhoods which are very nice and so on, where people of higher incomes live, and you have other neighborhoods which are not as nice, and where people of lower income, and they want to have at least the basic infrastructure the same, and which is something with which I certainly agree. Okay, so these people were marching, demanding a new constitution, change the economic development model without saying in which sense, and asking them for better pension, better health services, end of abuses, and more equality. Okay. Most of these peaceful demonstrations began peaceful but ended in violence. So initially we had that almost every day, talking a year ago. Today not. Today it's usually only on Fridays or something like this. You have a group of people marching, and which ends in violence in general. There have been a few exceptions which I might mention later. Okay, but the fact is that the police has not been able to control this violence, and which is a topic which merits another talk. Okay. Now the question is, what are these violence you know. I repeat, you see, you have an economy which is growing fast, which is becoming more equal, where there's a lot of social mobility, and nevertheless you get the social output. So you have to have environment with violence. So you have to have an explanation. And the explanation is that these violence are very diverse and not easily identifiable. You have the Chavistas, which are the people who follow Maduro in Venezuela and the 21st socialist doctrine. Okay, you have drug traffickers, very important. You have anarchists. In Chile, we always have had a group of ideological anarchists. You have soccer fans, which protest too. You know, they on weekends they go to the soccer games, but then during the week on Fridays they go to the violent marches. And you have ninis. Now ninis are people who are young people who don't study nor work, and so they have nothing to do, and so they also go to these marches. So you have this relatively diverse group of people which participate in the violent acts. Okay. The other thing which is interesting, I think, is that in a country like Chile, which has had, I don't know, 200 years, over 200 years of democracy, 70% of the population sympathized with the protest movement, and in particular, 58% of those believe that violence is a necessary condition to get economic and social reforms. So we had this big social approval of this social movement. You see, 58% of the people believed that violence is the necessary condition to get economic and social. I should have put violence believed. I should have put down belief, because that had changed a little bit. The last survey showed that it's a little bit below 50%. But still, about 50% believes that this is a necessary condition. Another big problem we have, and this is not so different in other democracies in the world. Another big problem we have is that there is a lack of credibility in the existing institutions. According to the latest survey we have on the subject, you see only a low percentage approve of the workings of the president, a very low percentage of the population approves of the workings of Congress, but the same thing is true for other institutions. There are almost no institutions which have a high social approval rating. Okay, so this is important, but I repeat, this is not a Chilean problem. This is a problem you find in many countries. Okay, now which has been the reaction of government to this? Very little, you see, because the government cannot use the military, because if they use the military, they're going to be accused of dictatorship, going back to the Pinochet years and so on. So the government cannot use. The police force is completely overflown by its violence, so that the police cannot do much. And so the government has been sort of trying to negotiate its way out of this crisis. And what the government is doing is implementing these following programs. Now, you can imagine that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, also makes it more difficult for government to be able to do many things, because we have been under quarantine some few months and so on. And so that makes it more difficult to get out of this crisis. But well, now what the government is trying to do is to do, if one is to recover the economy as fast as possible by way of wage rate subsidies and reform smaller taxes for small and medium-sized enterprises. They're certainly trying to push a social reform program in pension, health, and the other matters which interest the population. But their opposition is making it very difficult to have progress. Well, to try to reestablish order and get rid of the violent actions, you see. And finally, write a new constitution. Write a new constitution. The last 10 days ago, so we had a referendum on this issue, and by 80 to 20%, the population voted in favor of a new constitution. So in April 2021, we will elect a constitutional assembly, and a new constitution will be written. Now, some of people, of course, want that constitution to institutionalize a different economic model, and some of us, I'm included, believe that we should try to keep this part as open as possible, so that you can have different possible economic models. Now we can talk about that later on. Bien. Now the question is why this happened. You see, I sort of have been explaining to you the facts, but why did we have the outburst? It's not easy to explain. You see. And I personally think that in the short run, let's say, the fact that our growth rate dropped so dramatically after 2014. After 2014, our growth rate dropped from about 3.5 to 4% to 2%. So we had a big drop in the growth rate starting in 2014. And this big drop in the growth rate was unexpected. And so I think the fact that people were defrauded in their expectations might explain part of the problem. Okay, the other thing is that most families were heavily indebted. Since we have a free market economy, people could get as indebted as their banks and financial institutions allowed them to do that, and they got very heavily indebted. So the average family had a stock of that, which is about 70% of their income, which is relatively high. And so since they probably got in debt expecting a high growth rate, and they did not get this high growth rate, so they have trouble repaying their debt. And since they have trouble repaying their debt, they of course complain about the system. So I think this is important. Now, I don't want to minimize the underlying causes. You see, they decided to change the model, and all these reforms people want to have and improvements. We already talked about that, so I will not. But a very interesting question is, how important is foreign interference a factor in this outburst? You know, there are similar movements certainly in Ecuador and Colombia and Peru. So you have about the same phenomena in other countries in Latin America, and these movements are supported by political leaders, which has close ties to the Foro de Sao Paulo, which is sort of a socialist Latin American organization, which initially started in Brazil, but then moved towards Caracas and Venezuela. So it's, let's say, it's strange that you have the same movements all over the place, let's say. Now, the other thing is that if you look at the protests themselves, what you find is that suddenly you see thousands of people converge downtown Santiago. So, but you see, there's no open leader of this social outlet. There's no one person you can identify with it. There's no one spokesperson person for the movement. The movement looks as if the movement is spontaneous, but it's strange, you see, to have, for instance, they destroyed the first day, they destroyed 40 metro stations. 40 metro stations were burned and so on, all the same day at the same time, Friday evening. And so this seems strange, you know, that you have that. The other, when you look at the protests themselves, you find that you have vans which come with food and drinks and so on for the protesters, and which also seems strange since there's no one spokesman or so on. Now, the interesting thing is that a government also it hinted that the foreigners might be involved in the movement. The government has not been able to identify any person. So it is not possible to argue seriously that, you know, there is foreign interference in our affairs. There are some hints that it might be, but not more than that. Okay, so to conclude then, we had, I think, a relatively successful development experience in the last 40 years on the basis of the social market economy I described before. The government, then we had the social outburst, and the government has been then forced to go along with some of the forced social reforms, and especially has been forced to actually sponsor the rewriting of the constitution. Now, I have no doubt that the country will not be the same after the outburst than before. But now how much of the model will remain in force, I think is still to be determined. So those are my basic points, and we can talk about them.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Professor Lüders. I thought that was at least very interesting about something, specifically the protest, something that sort of the media here tends to skirt over. What's happening in Latin America tends to be a much more Eurocentric focus. So I guess we now have approximately 15 minutes to cover some questions that I have and that have been submitted to me. So I guess the starting point linked to sort of what you were saying at the end then is that, I guess, if inequality is falling like you showed and social mobility is rising, why is there such a desire for economic and social reforms that so many people would endorse violent action to achieve them, given that, as you mentioned, indebtedness and sort of lower economic growth than expected, that doesn't really seem sufficient for sort of the depth of support for the violent aspects of the movement?
I don't know. You see, for me, it's difficult to understand because the standard of living of the average low-income Chilean certainly has changed dramatically. The growth rate of income, which is income from work plus income received in the form of government subsidies. You see, that average income of the last decile or the last quintile have increased much faster than the income of the rich. You see. And so in terms of income, absolute income, let's say, it's difficult to explain the social outburst. Now, what one could perhaps argue is that once people have something, then they can actually protest. Perhaps, you see, when they're very poor, they have no means to protest, because if they protest, then they might get punished. They will die of hunger and so on, like what happens in some of the African economies. But once you are well enough off, let's say, you have an income which is high enough to be able to sustain yourself, you can protest, but still, why at that moment? You see, so my guess that this has all to do with expectations. Now, in what I presented, I just centered it on income, you know, on the difference between the expected rate of growth and the actual rate of growth, and related it to the debt. But there are other aspects in which I think expectations were also defrauded. Let me give you a few examples. One example is education and higher education, university level education, tertiary education. Around 1970, maybe 10% of the population had access to tertiary education. Today, about 60% of the population is actually having tertiary education. The population in the age of going to the university is actually having tertiary education. You see, so you have a jump in the quality, in the extension of education, from 10% of the population in the age of receiving that education to around 60% of the population in the age of receiving that education. So a tremendous change. But what happened? You see, before, tertiary education was very exclusive. You had a few people receiving it, which were usually high-income people, and the quality of that tertiary education was extremely high. Now we have expanded tertiary education so that almost everybody will eventually have access to it, but the quality is quite diverse. You have, like, I think you probably have in the United Kingdom, but you certainly have in the US. You have, which I know better, you have today a few very good universities for Latin American standard, but you have many others which are of much lower standard. And I think people expected that if they would get education, university level education, they would get the income they saw at the time people graduating from university were receiving. So if you had an economist in the 1970s graduating from Catholic University, he would be a person with a very high income. And so people extrapolated that. They said, well, if I receive high level education, tertiary level education, I will receive a high income. But this, of course, is not true. If you have a degree from a poor university, your income will be lower, even if you have the same title. You know, you might be an economist, but an economist from Catholic University and an economist from a low quality university are very different animals, very different animals. But people probably expected to receive the income of a Catholic University graduate, and they're not. So they were defrauded in their expectation. They should have anticipated it, but they did not. It's even worse, because what happened was that to be able to finance this expanded tertiary education for everybody, the government granted credits to those people receiving the education. So if you wanted to study, you could do it if you had the qualifications for it. And how did you finance it? You finance it with a credit. Government created low interest rate. Okay, but when you took the decision to study or not to study, you took the decision on the basis that you would receive a very high salary. And so you could repay that loan very easily. But once you graduated, you found out from a bad university, you found out that your income was relatively low. Then the debt burden became very important. Well, and so the same thing is true with health, you know, where you expected a certain quality of health and you didn't get the quality of health you expected. Also, health services were expanded to everybody, and everybody has a relatively good standard of health service and so on. But some of them have to repay something, and that puts them into trouble.
Okay, thank you. That was a really interesting answer. Moving on to sort of a more general line, more towards what the sort of first half of your presentation focused on the historical experience of Chile. Why do you think other South American countries have struggled so much economically, both historically, but also in recent years? I mean, for instance, looking at Argentina with respect to, several defaults on its debt obligations.
That's the $1 million question. Of course, the easy answer, the easy reply, and let me go back there. The easy reply is that we follow the wrong economic policies, right? So I believe that this graph here clearly shows that economic systems are very, very important in determining outcomes, which seems obvious, but it's not so obvious for many people. But what seems obvious is that you have the right economic system, you will develop, or at least you will grow. If you don't have the right system, you will not grow. Well, so the easy answer is to say, well, because we adopted during the 20th century, when I say we, Latin American in general, under the influence of the Economic Commission for Latin America, under the influence of the Economic Commission for Latin America, adopted this import substitution industrialization model, you see, in which we, on the one hand, protected, in quotes, protected local businesses through high import tariffs, and on the other hand, we had a government which intervened discretionarily in the allocation of resources, which very often was very inefficient and catering to political pressures. So the easy answer is that we had the wrong system. But the question is, why did we adopt the wrong system? You see, because while we were growing slowly because we adopted the wrong system, the United States and after the war, the European countries and so on, were growing very rapidly, you see. So they adopted the right system. So why did Europe and the United States and so on, after World War II, adopt the right system and we adopted the wrong system? And I don't know, I don't have the explanation. It's, in a way, it's not an economic problem. You see, the economic problem is the relationship between the system and the outcome. The political question is, why does a country adopt one system or another? I have an explanation for the Chilean case. And the Chilean case is slightly different from the rest of Latin America because I already told you that the same type of graph you get if you compare Chile with Latin America. Now, the Chilean case is related to the Pacific War. We went into war against Bolivia and Peru around 1880. And as a consequence of that, we made ourselves of mineral-rich territories, which are today's north of Chile, and nitrates and copper, gold, silver, and so on. And so we became suddenly very rich, in quotes, and that caused what's called Dutch disease. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but Dutch disease is the loss of competitiveness of your local activities if you discover a natural resource. When the Dutch discovered petroleum in front of their coasts, their exchange rate in the American sense of the word appreciated, and the Dutch were not able to compete anymore industrially with the rest of the world, and so they had to, you see, export their industrial activities to other countries. Okay, and we've suffered Dutch disease at the end of the 1880s, and that induced then a lot of changes, which explain, I think, why our GDP per capita dropped relative to the GDP per capita of other regions up until the Great Recession. And then after the Great Recession, we adopted the same policies all developing countries adopted after the Great Depression, and which were protectionist and which were characterized by very arbitrary government intervention. And that led to very bad allocation of resources and very slow technological progress. And as a consequence of that, we didn't grow. But the question is why? Why did we adopt the wrong model instead of adopting the right model? Now, in the case of Chile, when we changed in 1973, the explanation, of course, is we changed because we had an authoritarian political regime, Pinochet, and because we had the technology which was brought down, let's say, by the Chicago Boys.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very interesting answer. Two more questions and sort of linked to, I think we've got time for two more, and they're linked to the authoritarian regime. So firstly, I mean, Chile experienced two major recessions under Pinochet's authoritarian regime, the former of which saw inflation reach 375% in 1974, which was the highest rate in the world and almost double the top rate under Allende, and the latter of which saw real economic output decline by 19%. Why do you think market reform and liberalization policies succeeded after Pinochet left office, but not as much during his tenure?
Well, you have the facts more or less right, but not completely. Huh? Let me tell you that the high inflation rate was in 1973, where we reached over 500% per year, 73, and that was under Allende. It was before Pinochet came in. Actually, Pinochet came into power probably as a reaction to the economic policies of the Allende regime. So that's a small difference. But you're right. You see, if you look at the performance, even if you take the average performance under the military regime, the average performance under the military is below the performance of the next decade, let's say, of the next decade. So one can compare 2 decades, the first decade of Pinochet with the first decade of the democratic regime, let's say. Okay, and so I compare 73 to 83, let's say, something like this, with 90 to 2000. Yeah, okay, and there you get exactly what you say. You have a relatively bad performance under the Pinochet regime, and you have a relatively good performance under the democratic regime. Now, the thing is, you see, the military regime made an economic revolution, and that has a cost. And so by definition, you see, what you would expect if you compare one, in quotes, normal decade, the democratic one, with one which is clearly abnormal, because you have an economic revolution there. Many industries and so on, businesses disappeared, others were created. It was a tremendous change, you see. And so I would expect a lower average economic growth rate in a revolutionary period and a normal period. But the other reason, and this is interesting, and there are some very good papers about the subject, is that you see a military regime they have one problem, especially in a case like Chile, where they wanted to eventually go back to democracy, that you don't know what will come next, you see? So you have a tremendous uncertainty. So businesses are not willing to invest long-term because they don't know which regime will come after the dictatorship. Whereas democracies tend to be very, very conservative. And even democracies which are, in quotes, led by liberals, let's say. But they are very conservative. Democracy, by definition, is very conservative. And therefore, uncertainty is much lower than under a military regime. And so once, you see, it became clear that the democratic regime would continue with the same model, the businessmen started to invest heavily in Chile. And that explains the higher growth rate.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Again, another really interesting answer. So I think we've got time for one final question, and it would be this one. With the benefit of hindsight, would you say that the extent of the market liberalisation reforms undertaken in Chile was justified? Since effectively, I mean, the sort of reductions in inequality came much later than when most of the market liberalisation reforms were taken. You start seeing the reduction in inequality dramatically from about 2005, 2006, according to one of the charts you showed earlier. So effectively, initially, it was almost focused on economic growth in and of itself rather than a more distributed economic growth. So do you think the original focus on just market liberalisation without sort of safety nets for the poor was justified in hindsight?
No, look, you see, the market liberalization is not an end, right? And there was never an end in itself. The end was the reduction of poverty. That was the end. The market reduction, the market liberalization is a means you use to achieve a certain goal. You see? And what the Chicago boys tried to achieve was a rapid economic growth rate, so that they could reduce rapidly the poverty in Chile. So the objective was to reduce poverty. Now, the mistake, perhaps, or whatever name you want to give it, was to believe that if you reduce poverty, you would also reduce income inequality. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. Didn't happen until 19, I forgot, let me check the data. There. It didn't happen until 2000, right? So, but the objective was to reduce poverty. And to reduce poverty, we knew that what you had to do was to grow as fast as possible. Because if you grew fast, you would reduce poverty. And we hope that would lead also to a reduction in income distribution. It did not lead to a reduction in income until the year 2000. After 2000, yes.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think that's more or less all we have time for. So thank you very much, Professor Lüders. I believe I speak for everyone in saying that was a really insightful and interesting talk on a topic that a lot of us wouldn't be particularly familiar with, I imagine. Thank you for coming today. If anyone only caught the last part, this talk will be available to watch on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube channel after the event has finished. I believe our next talk is a discussion with the former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke. So I look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Ben. It was a pleasure.